I hate slick and pretty things. I prefer mistakes and accidents, which is why I like things like cuts and bruises. They're like little flowers. I've always said that if you have a name for something, like a cut or a bruise, people will automatically be disturbed by it. But when you see the same thing in nature, and you don't know what it is, it can be very beautiful.
Now, this may sound like something once said by a trench-coated man on the subway at 3 a.m., but it was actually said by a much more deranged suit-coated man on the subway at 3 a.m. This man is David Lynch. David Lynch is considered to be one of the West's greatest examples of filmmaking, especially considering surrealism in the American mythos. Before pretentious college dweebs could drone on about the symbolism and the pan shots, and actually all the women dying in his films is very feminist. David Lynch had to be born or died or something. Here to talk about it, this freak show.
Welcome, friends, welcome. Our program for you tonight is full of enchanting sights and chilling tales. We have hookers and sugar-free diets. We have golden retrievers and flood money, gun violence and fresh-cut lawns, dead bodies and Reganites. Stay, have a seat, have a drink, have a laugh, and remember, everything is an illusion.
Part 1. David, a Man. Illusions and Blue Velvet. David Lynch was born, as most people are, in a room in the shade of painted purity, surrounded by strangers with sharp objects, red-faced and crying. The year was 1946, and the setting was Missoula, Missouri. Born to Presbyterian parents, his father was a research scientist for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and his mother was an English language tutor. He was shoved around the States, always landing somewhere in Middle America, in fine towns with fine people. He was a Boy Scout, he was popular, he had a younger brother named John, and he was fairly happy. A perfect American child for a perfect American family. It was heaven, and everything was fine. In heaven, everything is fine. But David, even as a boy, was not satisfied with this illusion of truisms. He knew at an early age what the real America was built on: dead bodies, sex, drugs, and lies.
Like a flame burning brightly, but when she left, gone was the glow of blue velvet.
My childhood was elegant homes, tree-lined streets, the milkman, building backyard forts, droning airplanes, blue skies, picket fences, green grass, cherry trees. Middle America as it's supposed to be. But on the cherry tree there's this pitch oozing out. Some black, some yellow, and millions of red ants crawling all over it. I discovered that if one looks a little closer at this beautiful world, there are always red ants underneath. Because I grew up in a perfect world, other things were a contrast. None of his films represent this contrast as well as Blue Velvet, a tale of an all-American boy caught up in prostitution, drug rings, and murder. Unlike Tarantino or Scorsese, Lynch did not depict these things as pleasurable. Gun violence is not cool, death is not quick, and a naked woman's body is nothing short of shocking. In the 1980s, people were becoming more comfortable with having sex and violence as forms of entertainment. In 1985, the year before Blue Velvet was released, the most watched films were Clue, a murder mystery, After Hours, a sex comedy, and Fright Night, a gore fest. It was clear what the American public wanted: blood, guts, and boobs. While they were becoming numb to these things, Lynch made them disturbing again. He made them real again. He wanted to not only expose, but carve open the rotted pink underbelly of America. Blue Velvet is a film so far removed from reality, something copied over and over again to the point of absurdity, where it is no longer a member of the mystery genre. It does not subvert or recontextualize it, rather, it is rebirthed into something entirely new. This is Rod Serling, carbon copy. This is Nancy Drew, carbon copy. This is Maltese Falcon, carbon copy. Something redone and relived and rebirthed so many times that it is a stranger to the original. It is not a parody, rather it is simply an illustration. This is what David Lynch chooses to do with teenage detectives, dead bodies, and nudity for kicks. He chooses to make it alien again, uncomfortable again, real again. Real through the surreal. Real by focusing in on what is so often ignored or misunderstood. He does not cut away and ease our minds with implication. Rather, he hones in and forces us to look at it, to understand the disgust of the situation. We see Dorothy get sexually assaulted. We see her standing in a stranger's living room, beaten, naked, and vulnerable. Lynch does not allow us to view this impassively. We too are in that living room, and we aren't allowed to leave. This is what we see in Blue Velvet: vulnerability, horror, and the ignorance that blinds us of it. We see it when Jeffrey's father falls ill on his lawn, when no one notices the ear in the grass, and when the cops allow a drug kingpin to infiltrate their workforce. People ignore the ugly to survive, and Lynch decided to home in on that fact. Attention! I am going to talk about filth. Clear all children and Mormons from the premises. Are we good? We're good. As Lana Del Rey once said, "My pussy tastes like Pepsi Cola. My eyes are wide like cherry pies." And while some esteemed scholars may describe this as little more than a young woman's raving erotic lunacy, it does bring up an interesting and prominent part of Lynch's work: the intersection of prominent American idealism and blunt, often violent sexual encounters. Now miss, I can feel both of us growing uncomfortable as I speak. In fact, the regret of the Lana quote is creeping up on me right now. And I know you definitely don't want to hear a 17-year-old's take about sex in a strange old man's movies, but it's a little bit necessary, so I'll try to make it as quick and school-appropriate as possible. In David Lynch's Blue Velvet, the main character, and then this other guy comes in and and then they both start. And basically, she just ends up.
So let's talk about it.
Like I previously mentioned, sex is a very prominent theme in most of Lynch's works, especially Blue Velvet, where the main character has sexual relations with a prostitute that is used for sex by her husband's boss. Lynch is not interested in the pure, all-American hooker like that of Pretty Woman, rather focusing on sexual deviancy, depravity, and desperation. Frank likes mommy doms, Dorothy is a Stockholm submissive, and Jeffrey is, well, a massive whore. Lynch does not see sex in this film as glamorous. It's gross, it's disturbing, and when you look into his personal history, it becomes evident as to why. But we'll get to that later. There's also some Oedipal implications here, with Frank being Jeffrey's surrogate father, although in his sexual fantasies he's Dorothy's baby, and Dorothy being Jeffrey's surrogate mother, one of these people who he kills and the other one who he has sex with. In this film, sex is not a symbol of pleasure or power, it is a symbol of vulnerability. When Dorothy is first seen naked, it is while a strange boy is watching her, without her knowledge. When we first see Jeffrey undressed sexually, it is while he is being threatened with murder And when we first see Frank sexually, he is pretending to be a child. While he is our villain and while he is assaulting someone, we don't see the act as powerful. We see it as pathetic. When we see Dorothy naked, it is through wildly different contexts. One while she is undressing in the comfort of her home, and the other while she is beaten and lost in a stranger's living room. And yet, that same vulnerability is there. She is first born and then beaten. This transition starts almost immediately while she is being assaulted by Frank. Unlike the rape scene in Pulp Fiction, and again, I hate to keep bringing up Quentin Tarantino, but I am pretentious, so it is by law that I must do so at least every 3 hours. Anyway, unlike Pulp Fiction's rape scene, Blue Velvets is not played for laughs, except for maybe some uncomfortable ones. By turning one of humankind's most pleasurable pastimes into a disturbing image of pain and repugnance, Lynch is able to truly convey the emotion of bad sexual experiences. He is able to disturb instead of display. He shows us the true face of the sexual underground of America. A naked woman is not made for you. She is not your toy, nor is she your art. She is vulnerable. She is open to you, and often she is uncomfortable. Blue Velvet is, in essence, a snapshot of Lynch's America. It was, as he said, inspired by red lips, green lawns, a love song, and an ear lying in a field. There is a perfect contrast to the pretty, happy home and the true beasts that lie beneath. This outlook on his country was heavily inspired by the politics of the time. Lynch grew up in the forefront of the Cold War and was raised in the heights of it, when American propaganda was near unavoidable. In movies, in schools, in the news, America was shown to be a place of freedom and prosperity, a place where any man can be a king. But this was a lie. As much as they tried, American idealism could fool everyone but the children of America, and those who paid attention. The Reagan administration ended just 2 years before the release of this film, and its effect is clear. Reagan tried so desperately to feed an idea of suburbia, nuclear families, and economic bliss, he chose to ignore people dying under his care. Crack epidemic, which largely affected poor and black communities, AIDS, a disease thought only to be caught by druggies, homos, and sinners, and the Vietnam War, which was believed to protect the only wholly American way, but senselessly killed Americans and Vietnamese alike. Reagan didn't care about these people because they weren't American. If you weren't perfect, you weren't allowed into his America. And if you weren't allowed in, you were as good as dead. So, there existed two Americas, the one presented to the world, a place of prosperity and joy, and the one presented to Americans, a place where one must claw their way to consumerism or lie dead at the feet of its children. Lynch witnessed this contrast firsthand. In fact, in the scene where Dorothy appears naked, it was largely influenced by an incident in his youth when he and his brother were walking down the neighborhood streets and they saw a woman standing naked. This incident traumatized him so much that it caused him to cry, and he had never forgotten about it. Someone slipped up, and the curtain was pulled back. Only for a moment. Lynch spent the next 20 years of his life peeling back the lie. In a world where everyone told you who you have to be good, it was ever so freeing to choose the life that had been hidden from him. The life of true freedom, where not everything has to be good. A place of pain, a place of creation, a place of true, all-American freedom.
Part 2. David, a Director. Identity and Lost Highway.
Bet you thought I was gonna be dressed like that blonde hooker, huh? You thought wrong. I live for the mystery man. He's a devil and a poison, and he's got weird f***ing eyebrows. But before we can get to him, first we have to talk about David Lynch as a free man. The first and most important thing an individual can do is to become an individual again, decontrol himself, train himself as to what is going in, and win back as much independent ground for himself as possible. Much like the beat poets of 1940s America, Lynch spent his early adulthood in shabby apartments, barely making ends meet, watching his friends descend into drugs and madness. As said by Kerouac, better to sleep in an uncomfortable bed free than sleep in a comfortable bed unfree. And boy, was Lynch eager to shed that comfort. He welcomed liberty and its hardships with open arms. He was an art student after all. He studied painting at the Corcoran School of Arts and Design, later attending the School of the Museum of Fine Arts. Weird name. He dropped out after 1 year due to not feeling inspired at all by that place, opting instead to backpack around Europe. Yes, Lynch is the most annoying college student that you've ever met. Sucks to suck. He returned from an uneventful trip to the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. There, he met his future wife and mother of his first child. They lived in a relatively cheap apartment in a city ridden by crime and poverty. Also like the beat poets, Lynch gathered much inspiration for his art during this period, a time of pure self-government, rebellious teen anarchy realized in an anti-consumerist dream. We lived cheap, but the city was full of fear. A kid was shot to death down the street. We were robbed twice, had windows shot out, and a car stolen. The house was first broken into only 3 days after we moved in. The feeling was so close to extreme danger, and the fear was so intense. There was violence and hate and filth. But the biggest influence in my whole life was that city. He made his first short film during this time, which he later called 57 Seconds of Growth and Fire and 3 Seconds of Vomit. While it did not garner much profit, it did gain some recognition, awarding first prize at the Academy's year-end exhibit. While the film was meant only to display his skills in animation, in his own words, creating a moving painting, it set him down the path of the David Lynch we know today. In your 20s, once the curtain has been ripped open and you are faced with the red, staring eyes of the world, you are on a constant search for your identity. When you are a child, your identity is given to you. When you are a teenager, your identity is made of negatives, what you don't do, what you don't like, who you don't care about. In your 20s, you realize the pointlessness of these things, and then you are left with nothing, which signifies you. This beginning and change of identity, from boy to husband to father to painter to director, is something David shows a great interest in. Identity as an ever-changing picture, a painting that moves. The theme of lost and found name tags, of a carousel of characteristics and faces, is seen most apparently in his 1997 film, Lost Highway. The premise of the film is as follows. Fred Madison, a saxophonist, is framed for his wife's murder. He is sentenced to life in prison, he gets a terrible headache, and he disappears from his cell, leaving only a young man by the name of Peter Dayton, whose love interest is identical to Fred's dead wife. The film comes to a climax as Pete enters a cabin, becoming Fred, to find the mystery man, the one who framed him for his wife's murder. The film ends as Fred drives off in the night, alone and screaming, leaving carnage and more bodies behind. Clearly, identity is an important element of this film, wherein characters transform into strangers, identical faces play multiple characters, and everyone and everything is connected. Subconsciously inspired by the O.J. Simpson trial, an event where one's identity was defined by speculatory action, forever changing with new evidence presented. There is no one definite moral OJ. There is no one definite being. They exist only as a present moment, and only through individual perceptions. This is Lynch's view on identity, that there is none, that there is only an idea. In Hinduism, there is a concept of Idna's net, wherein all the consciousnesses in the world are connected. The Hindu view is that the consciousnesses, or Atmans, are important, and that each individual consciousness is God. The Dalai Lama is related to the consciousness of a butterfly is related to the consciousness of photons coming out of the sun. The Buddhist view is that the connections are what's important. We think we exist and therefore we suffer. We exist as both the observer and the subject being observed. We are only able to understand ourselves as separate. This is an illusion. There is no essential one true me or you. There is no essential one true Fred. When Fred must split into these three people, it is a way to cope with his contrasting identities, an ideal version of himself in Pete, a demonized version of himself in the mystery man, and a version of himself from which he must separate to understand. This is Fred. An observer. As Walt Whitman once said, very well then, I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes. And as David Lynch once said, my cow is not pretty, but it is pretty to me. Identity is made up in this film through connections and influences. David has many of these, largely Western and European influence, including French, German, Italian, English, and obviously American. These include Alfred Hitchcock, Federico Fellini, Jacques Tati, Francis Bacon, and Edward Hopper. David's early life and artistry filmmaking were also heavily inspired by postmodernism and avant-garde, borrowed, taken, and reinvented by Lynch, made into his own. Postmodernism and the avant-garde are in themselves rejections of forced identities and an acceptance of deeper levels to one's being and place in society. By incorporating previous ideas and theories, Lynch was able to fully realize his own creative vision. American author David Foster Wallace, who was once a dedicated avant-gardist during his college years when he studied writing, spoke partially on these influences on Lynch's work. Although he later chalked it up to bad writing, he felt disillusioned with the teachers at his grad school who were all realists as opposed to his postmodernist ideals. Then, he went to go see Blue Velvet for the first time. He described it as a film that may have debts, especially regarding Hitchcock, but is ultimately a new and original kind of surrealism that doesn't come from any previous tradition or postmodern theory. Rather, it is entirely David Lynch. This viewing experience led Wallace to the revelation that the purpose of these beliefs, of avant-garde, was not to follow any tradition or dogma, but rather create through a place of authenticity. Lynch was not only influenced by these philosophies, he revolutionized them. Common themes in all his films are often seen repeated. Well, obviously they're common, but you know what I mean? Like, in every one of his films, these things appear. They're all connected. They don't need same names, same places, but they are all the same. They're all one story. The plot always regards some sort of changed timeline, dreamlike logic, or surrealism. The genre, usually neo-noir, thriller, mysteries. Subject matter, corruption, crime, sex, drugs, Hollywood, America, industry. The list goes on and on. Themes include identity, illusion, dreams, and time. The visual aesthetic, surrealist art, bold colors, movie star makeup, shiny things with rough interiors, and actresses and actors, as well as other collaborators such as Angelo Badalamenti, I butchered that name, I made that one up, Mary Sweeney, Joanna Ray, Laura Dern, Naomi Watts, Kyle MacLachlan, Scott Coffey, and Jack Nance. By having all these common threads in these films, David is not only able to introduce themes or ideas he wants to discuss, he's able to pick apart every level of them until he has explored them completely. He does not leave alone surrealism. He does not touch it for fun. He does not touch it to shock. He's interested in it. He is in love with these things. And that love is palpable. That love is seen in his work. You don't see a blockbuster for love.
The first and most important thing an individual can do is to become an individual.
Okay, so Lynch being a degenerate doesn't really have a lot to do with this section. I just like to call him one because his movies mostly contain sex and violence and drugs. And sometimes I just want to feel community with the fellas going with the mother effing and father effing earth, Besides, his degeneracy contributed heavily to his films, either as a spoonful of sugar to help young audiences digest more complicated themes, or as a way to expose the inner sickness of humanity. Either way, Lynch's aversion to the socially acceptable added to an underground popularity. He was a king, a god even, to American degenerates. At least this Canadian degenerate thinks so. By placing his film in a timeless setting, Hollywood, somewhere always full of glitz and glam, where new stars are always prepared to replace old ones, where things can be remade to the point of unreality, Lynch was able to create a world that is both relatable and alien. How many times have we imagined idyllic worlds where they didn't break up with us, where we could return to our old selves, where things could be different, another place, another time? By playing with time, Lynch is able to further elaborate surrealist themes. Lynch's work absorbs the aesthetics of the time period while leaving behind all the reality of the past. We think that the past is real. We think that time is real. But all the past is pictures and memories. It is an image, not a reality, a dream. The thing about dreams and reality is that we can never really know which is which. We can never really say which is more one or the other. A day in the life can be a nightmare, and a dream can provide revelations more real than the nose on your face. Dreams in David Lynch's films are used to represent a litany of things. Desire, alternate reality, the subconscious. He's able to represent the reality of dreams through various auditory and visual cues. For example, in the diner scene where one character is describing a nightmare he had to another, Lynch uses long, slow close-ups, minute facial movements, music cues, and lighting to place us in the visceral, oppressive environment of this experience. And when his dream is brought into reality, we feel as though we would in that dream. The sluggish body feeling fear, the feeling as though you were truly, spiritually about to die. Time exists as something that is bendable. A dream can be had within lifetimes, or it can span a short minute. It exists as a place where time is not a factor, so much as an informant. David Lynch, too, is timeless. By leaving time behind entirely, people from all periods can find value in his films, because they present something never seen before. Lynchian. The word Lynchian is an adjective referring to a concept, media, or image that invokes the style or themes of David Lynch. As David Foster Wallace puts it, it refers to a particular kind of irony where the very macabre and the very mundane combine in such a way to reveal the former's perpetual containment within the latter. This word has been applied to many different things, including a Spice Girls music video, Hereditary, and Scooby-Doo the movie. While some may dispute the meaning and applicability of this term, it does tell us one thing for sure. Lynch's unique style has made an evident and permanent mark on the film industry. And as Emma Madden of Vice states, the term is not only a descriptor of his work, but of the time we are living in, an uncannily cosmetic ballet with all the sinister, superficial juxtaposition it implies. This is to say that while Lynch's work aimed to escape or transform reality, it now perfectly reflects our current consumer-obsessed society, where all nuance is discarded to find the most attractive outcome. It is in our advertising, our politics, our neighborhoods. How many times has the polished exterior given way to the tainted interior? John Wayne Gacy was popular, Ted Bundy was charming, and the Columbine killers were perfectly nice boys from perfectly nice families. In my neighborhood, there were 2 shootings in the past year, both involving the mafia. And yet, from a distance, it looks like any other cookie-cutter place. Lynch has given us a definition for this. He's cemented his place not only in our screen and our vocabulary, but in our subconscious. A dead-eyed, white-toothed smile from a neighbor suddenly has an uncomfortable undertone. Plastic politeness now feels like a knife to the gut. A sociable smile, is nothing more than a mouth. Amazing. Lynch had an amazing amount of control over his films, having a hand in almost every aspect of the process. In 2 out of 3 films discussed today, he had served as a sound designer and writer in addition to directing. He has written all but one project in all of his career, having also served as an editor and producer on many of his works. Most of his films are very close to him, Blue Velvet being a prominent example, largely inspired by his childhood. One of the reasons he no longer makes movies is because there is no room for him in the current business-oriented Hollywood. The films he had complete creative control over were not always box office successes, and the ones that did turn a large profit were not the kind of works he wanted to put out. Lynch was so insistent on his need to author his films, he was willing to end his cinematic career. True. Well, there you have it. David Lynch was a guy who did something, some people liked it, some people did not like it. He was in Hollywood for a while, and now he isn't. So, yeah, that's pretty much it. Now, if you excuse me, I'm gonna go down a bottle of rosé and call my ex pretentious on Twitter. Good night, sweet prince.